Chapter 31-32. Harry didn't bother sleeping that night since his location was known by non-friendlies and getting caught napping would just be too embarrassing for him. Instead, he spent the night chilling with Goose on his lap and going over the information he had on the X-Men and his own future plans. He had 3 main goals for this venture. First priority was to remove the blocks on the Phoenix's avatar, the one called Jean. He did promise the Phoenix Force he'd do it after all. He already spent a large amount of time inside his own mind testing how blocking and unblocking mental abilities with psionics would work, and he wasn't going to do anything until he had a safe way to remove them. It was obvious who was responsible for the blocks, and he figured the man probably had reasons he thought were good, but Harry doubted Xavier would remove those blocks on Harry's word, even if he gave the man his memory of the conversation with the Phoenix. The second goal was to get practical experience in a few of the branches he was working with. Harry was skilled in engineering and programming but had little experience in chemistry and biology. One of the listed professors at the institute was Dr. Hank McCoy, and he was an expert geneticist Harry was eager to work with. Harry's final goal was to see if he could figure out other means of using his mutant power. He was hoping for an ability like that of Mystique's, which was similar to a wizard talent called Metamorphmagus. However, Harry had a feeling simply looking like someone else was not the limit of his mutant power. Thankfully, the Phoenix Force had given him a clue. She said that his mind wasn't strong enough, so Harry had been practicing advanced visualization techniques and mental landscaping. Harry had a very large imagination from all the things he'd seen and read, and even from the games he played, so he put a lot of time and effort into creating different mental landscapes with as much detail as possible as a mental exercise. Eventually morning came and Harry collected the various relics and traps scattered about his room. Even if Mystique and Pietro had attacked him last night, he could have used them to fight back without giving himself away, but thankfully it wasn't needed. That did mean that he broke the TV in the room without reason, but it was a worthwhile sacrifice for peace of mind. Harry set $300 in cash beneath the TV with a note saying he accidentally broke it, and set the keycard for the room on the bed before operating out. The grounds of Xavier's Institute of Gifted Youngsters were completely enclosed by a 10-foot steel fence leading up to an older-style stone entryway with a brass plaque showing the school's name. It looked quaint from the exterior, but that was only if you didn't pay attention to the overlapping field of vision of the security cameras and motion sensors hidden in plain sight around the premises. Harry even spotted several places that appeared to be hidden panels, and he wouldn't be surprised if turrets popped out of them to welcome uninvited guests. The gate to the institute was opened and Harry casually walked in with a suitcase, his backpack, and his pet carrier. The moment Harry approached, he felt the phoenix flames within him reach out, which wasn't surprising. He wondered if the one at the other end felt the same thing. Further up the path, Harry saw a basketball court to his left with several kids playing around. What was funny was that one team was composed of various kids, while the other team seemed to be a set of 5 of the same kid. A few of the spectators of the game saw him walking up the road with a suitcase and pet carrier and put 2 and 2 together, so a couple of them smiled and waved at Harry, who smiled and waved back. This place certainly did have a warm atmosphere. Harry reached the entrance, but before he could knock, the door opened and a familiar green-eyed redhead was staring him down. Harry smiled and said, "Hello again. I'm here for a tour. Would I be lucky enough to have you as a tour guide?" The redhead blushed for a moment and said, "No, I was just coming to check on something." Harry said, "Well, if that something is me, you may check it out as long as you wish." She tried to frown in disapproval but was fighting a smirk to do so and said, "You're a pervert, aren't you?" Harry answered back, "If you mean a bearer of uncommon inclinations, I am not, or at least I don't think I am. If you mean open about who I am in general, then perhaps. Besides, having uncommon inclinations isn't something to look down on. Aren't you already inside my head, peeping on my thoughts?" Harry felt the telepath's presence, but it was different compared to Xavier's. It was not that she was actually intruding, it was more that her mind didn't seem to just fit inside her own head and ended up entering the minds of those within a specific range. She blushed once more and said, "I'm sorry. I'm still having difficulties controlling my powers." Harry smiled back and said, "Don't worry. You can enter my mind anytime you wish to look around, but don't try to read any of the books without asking me for a library card. I happen to know a thing or two about the mind, and if you want someone to bounce ideas off or a different perspective, I'd be happy to lend an ear and maybe a nose." She rolled her eyes and said with a smirk, "I thought you hadn't decided to join yet." "Well, I've already found an excellent reason to stick around, so there isn't much of a point to pretending otherwise." The telepath narrowed her eyes and said, "Is that so?" Harry thought to himself, "Yes, I found out how much of a genius Dr. Hank McCoy was and that he teaches here." She blinked at that thought and said, "Oh. Harry smiled and said, "What did you think I was thinking of?" She sighed and said, "Never mind. I'm Jean Grey, by the way." Harry held out a hand and said, "Harry Potter, again, it's a pleasure." She shook it and said, "I'll take you to the professor. He's expecting you." Several other kids of various ages were walking around, which was something that did somewhat surprise Harry. This was a boarding school, but this was also summer, meaning no classes, which meant most kids would be back home with their parents. Jean didn't seem to be able to turn off her telepathic eavesdropping and said, "A lot of kids don't come from families that are accepting of mutants. My own parents, for example, are the epitome of normal and are uncomfortable with me around, so I stay here full time." Harry knew she was sharing stuff about herself to make up for the fact that she was unable to stop herself from violating his privacy, even though he already said it was fine. Harry said back, "Then it sounds like you dodged a bullet. I have nothing against those comfortable with living black and white lives, but personally I prefer a little color." He also thought, to himself, he wished he inherited his mother's vibrant red head instead of his father's messy black hair. "Your hair is fine, Harry," Jean easily said. She wasn't sure what to think about Harry. When someone knew they were with a telepath, their minds often became darker and their fears came to the surface, which made them awkward to be around. She wasn't used to someone so at ease with others invading their mind and treating it just like a normal conversation. That and the fact that somehow, when she purposely entered Harry's mind, the sound of others' thoughts went away. There was something about his mind that felt warm and comfortable to her. She was even tempted to ask for a library card. Harry said aloud, "Ah, if that is your opinion on the matter, then I am greatly relieved. If you thought I was boring, I might have ended up dyeing my hair blue or something." Jean tried to imagine Harry with blue hair and started giggling. Harry thought if it was funny to her, at least that meant he would have successfully gotten her attention, which would have made it worth it. They arrived at an office and Jean knocked twice before a moment of silence passed and she opened the door. Xavier, Logan, and Ms. Monroe were together once more having a discussion. Xavier said, "Ah, welcome Harry. And thank you Jean for escorting Harry to my office." She said, "You're welcome, Professor. See you later, Harry." She left and moments later her presence was gone from Harry's mind. Xavier waited for the door to close and said, "Now Harry, before the tour, I'd like to inform you a little about us and the beginnings of the X-Men." Harry pulled up a seat and patiently waited. He did love a good story. The X-Men were founded 25 years ago and Logan and Aurora were founding members. At the time there was a powerful psionic entity who called itself the Shadow King, and he was using his vast influence to gather mutants and start a war in the Middle East that would encompass the whole of the world. With the help of an old friend of mine, I was able to gather an opposing team and lead them against the Shadow King's forces and defeat them. With the help of others I was able to beat back the Shadow King on the astral plane and win the day, though the cost of victory was not low. Many of those who fought with me agreed to join me here to open a school as both a home for mutants and a place they could safely train the use of their powers. The X-Men are dispatched to areas where mutants are causing conflict to rescue those who need it and facilitate peace if possible." Harry was rather surprised the Shadow King had been beaten, as a few of the books of Camartage had mentioned him. He was very, very old. Usually the Sorcerer Supreme would handle him, but it seemed rather than make himself powerful, he hid under the radar and gathered a powerful force on the mortal plane to do his bidding. Keeping himself weak enough to avoid detection by the Ancient One worked out, but he ended up losing to a mortal telepath because of it. Still, it was very impressive. Harry brought up the main point which came to mind, "You're not exactly on the telly a lot for all the things you say you do." Xavier nodded and said, "We do try to keep a low profile, and there are those in the government aware of us who do not restrict our cause or impede our actions, as the government itself cannot afford to take one side or the other on the mutant issue." Harry understood. He certainly knew a thing or two about the value of maintaining a low profile until the time was right. He said, "If you're asking me to join the X-Men permanently, I cannot give you an answer, as my life may take me in other directions further down the line. However, if I decide to attend your institute, I would love to go if invited to any party your X-Men decide to throw." Logan smiled a bit and Aurora rolled her eyes behind a small smirk. Xavier nodded and said, "I'm glad to hear you'll give it some thought. Now, on to the tour." Xavier's automated wheelchair moved quite fast and Harry followed with Wolverine next to the professor and Storm following behind them. Harry approved of this. Harry was, for all intents and purposes, an unknown. Outwardly they were escorting him, but it was more likely that they were acting as guard to subdue him should he try anything or perhaps go out of control. A weather sorceress together with an unstoppable metal-clawed warrior could cover most ranges, and even if Harry went all out, fighting them would be difficult. especially if Charles tried to attack his mind. Harry's defenses and attacks were probably good, but he still wasn't interested in matching them against someone the Ancient once considered perhaps the most powerful telepath I've ever encountered. The only reason Harry could even sense someone on that level in his mind was because he had placed several magic triggers in his mind which were invisible to anyone trying to sense them. Those triggers would tag the intruder, which was why Harry recognized Xavier as the Peeper when he first saw him. Those triggers however weren't foolproof though, so Harry had several other failsafes to work with. Xavier first showed Harry the rooms. The mansion had over 30 rooms and only 50 students, but during the summer many had their own room while during the school year students usually had roommates. Harry sensed the space in front of him cave in slightly and paused. He was a fast thinker, but pausing was really too good of a cheat not to abuse, so when something unexpected happened he would often pause to determine his options. The indented space was closer to Harry than it was to Logan, so the clawed warrior wouldn't be able to attack it faster than Harry could. There was also the chance it was a prank. Of course, if that was the case, Harry had to respond in kind. Harry unpaused and a blue-skinned teenager with a tail entered the space from the indentation. Harry paused again so he could get a good look at the new arrival, and the smile of mischief on his face told Harry everything he needed to know. Harry unpaused and moved his hand to flick the forehead of the teleporter just as he landed. The smell of brimstone that came from the smoke which followed the mutant through his indentation in space, which told Harry a great deal about his method of travel. The new arrival recoiled at the finger flick and said with a German accent, "Ow, why'd you do that?" Harry deadpanned, "It's a reflex. Happens every time a teleporter invades my personal space." Xavier turned back and smiled, "Ah, I see you've met Kurt. Kurt, this is Harry Potter. We're showing him around today in the hopes he may join us." Kurt gave a fake thoughtful expression and said, "I don't know, Professor. Such strange reflexes are sure to cause trouble." Harry put Goose down, took off his backpack, zipped it open and pulled out a smoky quartz. Harry then cast a Lumos inside it and made it vanish into his inventory. Once the act was finished he said, "Flexibility is important, you should be able to handle every situation that gets thrown at you." The lights in the hallway flickered just a bit as the blue demon's vivid blue hair grew to his hips in length and then turned vibrant pink. Harry was cheating a bit since that was 2 spells, but he doubted there was anyone there who'd be able to call him out on it. Thankfully the spell had only affected the electricity a little and did nothing else to the hall. The spell only took a second to reach full effect and Kurt grabbed his now long, pink hair through his 3-fingered gloves and stared at it in absolute horror. His hands were trembling and a moment later he fell to his knees and theatrically cried out, "No." Harry immediately liked him. Several doors opened in the hallway and they all saw the now pink-haired demon on his knees before a newcomer. Kurt got up and took Harry's shoulders and said, "Please. You must change it back. Pink is not my color." He emphasized the last sentence most of all. Harry shook his head and said, "It will wear off on its own later. I don't know when though. Probably before summer ends. Now, would you like anything else to become pink, or was there something else I could help you with?" Kurt recoiled back a step and vanished away in another burst of brimstone smoke. Logan was the first to respond, "How'd you flick him so fast?" Harry said, "One aspect of my abilities lets me sense energy. I've honed my senses for many years and can sense the change of space prior to a teleporter's arrival." Logan grunted, "That explains how you dodged Scott's optics last night." Xavier asked, "Are you experienced with teleporters?" Harry answered, "Very. I even learned how to do it myself when accessing the right kind of energy." The professor said, "Fascinating. I'd like to hear more on the subject when you have the time." After the dorms were the classrooms and introductions on various subjects taught during the school year. Next came the kitchen, the library, the lounge, and the home theater. Harry wondered if they would be willing to watch another universe's version of Star Wars that had different actors playing the same parts. He'd ask them later. Next they headed underground. According to Xavier, his great-grandfather had a massive fallout shelter constructed beneath the property and it had been remodeled over the course of the last few decades. The first room they entered had a gorilla-sized man completely covered in blue fur wearing glasses and an unbuttoned lab coat with nothing but black shorts and a yellow belt beneath it. Harry shouted, "Oh my god." And after a pause for dramatic effect continued, "Is that a oscillating frequency transmission electron spectrometer?" Harry then walked over to the massive piece of equipment in the lab, completely ignoring the giant blue glasses wearing monster currently staring at him. From behind him Harry heard in a dignified voice, "Why yes it is. How did you recognize it?" The idea of the machine itself was postulated in a science magazine a few months back, but the actual construction was easier said than done. It was a very useful machine despite the fact that one could technically do the same thing it could do using 6 other machines which were cheaper to make. However, doing several processes separately couldn't compare to the precision achieved by a single machine doing them all. Harry answered, I figured I could build one myself if I overclocked a good enough processor, but even the minimum requirement for that kind of tech can only be found in restricted military-grade equipment, and I don't have any facilities to make something better at the moment. Xavier rolled in watching Harry examine the theoretical machine like a child looking at a shiny toy. He said, it seems you already have a rather strong foundation in science, Harry. This was built by Forge, a man who I'm certain you'll enjoy meeting. He then gestured to the monster and said, and this is Dr. Hank McCoy, our resident geneticist. Harry stopped playing around and went over to Doctor and said, I'm Harry Potter, it is a pleasure to meet you, Dr. McCoy. Harry took a few more looks around the lab and recognized all but a few of the machines. He doubted Area 51 had toys this nice, and it certainly brought up the quality of this place by another level in his mind. Dr. McCoy saw a complete and utter lack of fear in Harry's eyes at his appearance despite his earlier jest. He smiled down at Harry and said, it is a pleasure to meet you too, Mr. Potter. Perhaps you can assist me with a few projects I have in the future. Another pair of hands that knows how to use this equipment would be greatly appreciated. Harry smiled and said, I'd love to help. I may even have a project or two in mind I'd like a second opinion on as well. Is that right? Well, I'd certainly love to take a look at any project someone with a mind such as yours has come up with. Perhaps later this week. Thank you, I'll organize and submit them to you later. Harry walked back over to his escorts who were still a bit dazed. They knew how intelligent Dr. McCoy was. They also knew that several of the more clever students had tried to be his assistant at one point or another, but most were unable to continue working with the high standard of equipment or the precision needed for lab work. There was something about the situation that worried them, but they couldn't quite place it. The end of the hall had a set of stairs going up past a sliding steel door. At the end of the stairs was a lanky man wearing goggles sitting in front of what appeared to be a control system. There was a large pane of glass on the wall behind the control system, and once he got closer Harry could see there was a massive room beyond it where 6 teens wearing different uniforms were running around facing mechanical obstacles. Xavier, whose chair somehow had no issue with stairs, said, Harry, this is Forge. And this is the danger room, he continued, motioning to the room beyond the glass. The man himself seemed to be immersed in something and Harry didn't want to bug him. Logan said, this is where most of our combat exercises and sparring happens. Wanna join them? Harry said, maybe later. I absorbed a few pounds of pure steel before our fight yesterday and the effect of it already wore off. I'll have a big crate of materials delivered by the end of the week so I can take part in the training. Ororo said with a smirk, so that means you're interested in joining? Absolutely. Did the professor tell you about my power? Logan smirked and said, you absorb metal for a boost in strength and gems for magic tricks. Close enough. I can also absorb food before a fight to grant limited healing and books. If I absorb a book it is gone forever, but I will have the content memorized for a few days before that effect wears off. If I go over it enough I can retain it though, which is why I'm a lot smarter than those of my age. I bought pretty much every college and university textbook around. The professor set his hands together pensively and said, if that is the case, practical experience is more valuable than classwork. Once we've assessed your comprehension level, I'll arrange for you to spend time with Dr. McCoy and Forge to gain experience. Both of them are the best in their fields. Thank you, Professor. The fact that he was going to make sure Harry was taught at the proper level made Harry respect him as a teacher, despite the man's obvious flaws. Ping. Quest complete. Get drafted with style, reward, multiplayer unlocked. Harry thought to himself, so that's a thing. Xavier gave Harry a key to an empty room where he would be staying and he headed over to unpack his things. What surprised him however was that the door wasn't locked. Harry entered the room and saw 2 beds, one of which already had a teen laying down, reading from a book. He looked about 2 years older than Harry with black hair styled back and said, hi, guess you're my new roommate. Harry frowned and said, maybe. I was told this room was empty. The teen sighed and said, not surprising. Hey, there is a piece of paper on the nightstand with a pencil. Write down what I look like on it and you'll figure out what's going on. Harry set Goose down and did as instructed. He wrote the description of the teen on the paper and said, okay, now what? Now don't look at me for 2 minutes, he went back to reading his book. Harry had no idea what that meant, so he set the paper down and let Goose out before he started unpacking his things. Several alarms in Harry's mind suddenly went off. Knowledge he had gained was being erased. He isolated the knowledge and determined it to be his most recent memory. Harry turned to face his roommate, who noticed it and said, "You remember me?" Harry paused and went back into his mind to look through what just happened. Covert obliviations were a real threat in the magical world, so Harry had a few defenses and alarms against memory and knowledge removal or modification, even though it never worked on him before. He determined that the quality of the memory of his new roommate was erasing itself and would be gone in a few hours. The only reason it would even take that long was because of the quality of Harry's mind. A normal mind would probably forget this person's existence moments after being seen, if they could even perceive him at all. Harry unpaused and said, "Mostly. Though my memory of you seems to erase itself when I'm not looking at you. Is that your power?" "Indeed it is, my impressive friend, indeed it is. You can call me Forget-Me-Not. My power is imperceptibility. Most completely forget I exist the moment they look away. Even if they remind themselves with a note, they still forget me moments after reading it. The professor said he put some mental timers inside his own head to remind himself I exist, but I guess I can't be too surprised they forgot me too." Harry couldn't hide the horror on his face. The teen noticed this and said, "Don't feel sad for me, dude. You'll forget me too every time you leave here." Now Harry almost wanted to cry. That wasn't something a person should just accept. It was the words of someone who had his hopes crushed too many times to ever get them back up. He wasn't going to let things stay that way, that was for sure. Harry paused again and went over the possibilities. After unpausing, Harry looked up and said, "Can I have one of your hairs?" Sure." He plucked a hair and handed it to Harry, who set it inside his inventory and turned around. Harry's inventory was a part of him and also time-locked. He innately knew every aspect of every item in his inventory, and he knew that the item he just placed in there was the hair of the guy sitting in the chair behind him. Harry focused on the memory and determined that it wasn't degrading. Harry wasn't sure which aspect of that idea caused it to work, but it did in fact work. After 2 minutes, Harry turned around and said with a smile, "Okay, it worked. I'm now immune to your power. My name is Harry Potter." Forget-Me-Not stared at him and weakly said, "What?" It took about 2 hours of tests for Forget-Me-Not to believe Harry would not in fact forget him. Harry then turned to Goose and said, "Hey Goose, do the things inside your pocket dimension get absorbed, digested, or get stored?" Forget-Me-Not said, "Wait, are you talking to the cat?" Goose conveyed back through their familiar link, "Just give me a lock of his hair. It will do for your purposes, and I'm not comfortable meeting someone for the first time over and over." Harry looked over to Forget-Me-Not and said, "Goose can do something similar with a pinch of your hair. Give me a second, I'll get some scissors." Forget-Me-Not said, "At this rate won't I go bald?" Harry got a pair of scissors from his backpack and went over to snip a band of hair from his scalp while saying, "If one day you have a girlfriend who complains about you being bald, you can say something to me then." Harry then said, "You may want to turn around for this. It isn't for those with a weak stomach." I think I'll be fine," he responded back. "I don't know how watching a cat eat my dash." Goose's mouth ejected out a mass of purple flesh covered in serrated teeth and wiggling tentacles. From within the void at the center of the flesh came a snake-like appendage of a tongue with its own set of razor-sharp teeth that approached Harry's hand and quicker than a snake strike grabbed the lock of hair before retreating in the pit, followed shortly after by the remaining mass of indescribable flesh that vanished into the Flurkin's mouth. After a moment of silence, Forget-Me-Not said, "Harry?" "Yes, Forget-Me-Not?" "What is that?" "That's Goose, my familiar. Don't worry, I've already asked her not to eat anyone." Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Harry considered it and said, "I'm not sure. At least this way, she won't forget you either." I'm not sure how to feel about that." Harry and Forget-Me-Not spent another hour chatting before they both headed out for lunch. So far they were becoming good friends, though Forget-Me-Not wouldn't give Harry his original name, claiming everyone who knew it has forgotten it, so that person was already gone. Harry didn't say it out loud to get his new friend's hopes up, but he was going to work on a way of allowing others to remember him. Harry and Goose both had internal pocket dimensions, though Goose never told Harry how her own worked and Harry had refrained from asking out of politeness. He couldn't expect others to have the same ability, but at least it proved that Forget-Me-Not's power had a loophole, and if there was one, they may be more. Although Harry could have skipped lunch or taken something out from his inventory, he didn't want to turtle up on his first day. According to Forget-Me-Not, there was a rotating roster of kids or adults who would stay in the kitchen for 2 hours cooking during lunch and dinner time. Today's lunch would be served by Jubilee, which meant the soda would soon run out to get the taste out of the recipients' mouths. He said she once set her cereal on fire. The kitchen had 3 kids at the table, with a petite girl of Asian descent wearing a yellow long coat standing over a stove making what Harry smelled to be burnt grilled cheese sandwiches. Harry sat down 1 seat away from the others and Forget-Me-Not sat down on his opposite side. The one called Jubilee turned around and said, "Hiya, will you be having the ribeye, the fresh Italian pasta, the baby lamb, or the lobster?" Forget-Me-Not said, "I'll be having the rotisserie chicken with mashed potatoes." He pointed at Harry and said, "Today's his first day here, so he'll be having the special of the day." Jubilee turned back around and said, "2 specials of the day, coming up." The trio sitting at the table looked over from their discussion and one said, "You're new here." "Hi. I'm Danielle." "That's Ron and Brian." The other she pointed at smiled back at Harry, who said, "Hello and nice to meet you, I'm Harry." The redhead named Ron asked, "You're British?" Harry recognized her clearly Scottish accent that reminded him a little of Professor McGonagall. He answered back, "That's right. I was born in Godric's Hollow near Suffolk." She nodded, "Born in Ullapool myself." "In the Highlands? I have a house up there. I actually went to a boarding school in a big old castle built at the base of the Highlands Mountains. Had to leave though because people kept trying to kill me." Ron looked shocked, sad, and a little understanding about that last part. Danielle, who seemed to be of Native American descent, said, "A good reason to leave." "So what's your power?" Harry answered, "I can turn into an owl." Ron and Danielle both said, "Really?" Harry shrugged, "Maybe, I don't know. I probably could." Brian said, "Be careful there, Harry, these 2 love animals and toying with them like that will end badly." Harry pulled a piece of smoky quartz out of his pocket and said, "In that case, I can grant 1 wish, but only 1 wish, and then I can never grant wishes again." "What would you 2 wish for?" Brian quickly said, "I wish for actual food that will stay in my stomach." Both girls turned to glare at him and Harry paused. He was half joking, but since that was the request, he might as well go with it. Plus, this was an opportunity to empty some of the food in his inventory. Harry picked up the smoky quartz and said, "Your wish is my command." He cast a lumos inside the gem to make it glow, which attracted everyone's attention, even Jubilee, who was letting the sandwich on the stove burn for way too long. Harry then cast a wordless Immobulus Maxima on the room, which had everyone frozen in place. Every electronic in the room would fry, but wishes had consequences, so he'd blame Brain for it. First he used telekinesis to lift the burning bread off the pan so it wouldn't catch fire while he was working. Next, while everyone was frozen, he took out dish after dish from his inventory and set it on the table. Harry couldn't put food or water into his inventory unless it was on a plate or in a container, so he had hundreds of plates, cups, bowls, and etc. in his inventory. Each plate even had the proper utensils for the dish. This did make Harry feel a little bad for whoever would be doing the dishes today. When the table had no more room for dishes, Harry cast some preservation and warming charms that would last until the dishes were picked up, and he sat back down in the same position but with the gem placed in his inventory, and he put the burnt bread back on the pan. Last, he cast a large finite incantatum which unfroze everyone who lacked awareness of time while frozen and now saw the table filled with food. Harry wanted to stack another layer of food on top, but his telepathy sensed someone else on their way to the kitchen and he couldn't have them walk in while everyone was frozen. Thankfully that teleporter wasn't likely to show due to the pink hair, though Harry was unsure how many teleporters the Institute had. From their perspective, the smoky quartz in Harry's hand was glowing and now it was gone and the table was filled with food. Jubilee was the first to break out of her stupor and said, "Oh hell yeah," and grabbed a plate and started chowing down. She didn't bother turning off the stove, almost like she had forgotten she was making food for someone. Danielle said, "What? Is this an illusion?" Jubilee said between bites, "Best tasting illusion ever." Harry said, "It's all real, so please help yourself to a plate." Each of the 3 picked up a plate and took a bite. Ron then quickly glared at Brian and slowly said, "Ye stole our wish." Danielle quickly turned to Brian, who realized his joke could now be taken as a declaration of war. He took his plate and ran around the table and was quickly followed by the pair of angry teenage girls. On the first circle he touched the 2 chairs they were sitting in, and then he ran at them who weren't expecting a turnaround and touched each of them. A moment later they both were pulled out of the air into their chairs and Brian ran away. Ron shouted at the running mutant, "Dinna think ye can hide from me. I know your scent." Danielle placed her shoulder on the angry Scotswoman, which calmed her down. Danielle said, "Forget about it. More for us." Harry wondered if anyone would remember the burning grilled cheese on the pan, which was now on fire. Forget-me-not sighed. Smoke alarm blares dash. Ron shouted over the alarm, "Jubbly, ye forgot to turn off te bloody stove." "Ops, sorry." She went back over to the stove and put it and the flaming sandwich into the sink, taking a moment to soak them both with water before taking a nearby cutting board and waving it at the smoke alarm until it went silent. The student Harry sensed earlier had arrived in the kitchen and said, "Anything not on fire?" Harry said, "A few things. Jubilee really outdid herself today." When the table was in sight, the newcomer said, "What? No way Jubilee did this." Harry said, "I think Brian did it then." Two more students came in, though Harry figured they came more to witness the carnage than they came to eat, as the smoke alarm was quite loud. Harry saw that Forget-Me-Not had taken his chair over to the wall and was calmly watching the new arrivals drop their jaws at the table of assorted food while holding the bowl of mashed potatoes Harry had originally set in front of him. Harry pulled his own chair over to sit next to Forget-Me-Not and said, "So you like people watching?" He shrugged, "I guess. Not much else to do. If I tell someone something, they'll either forget what I told them or forget where they learned it at some point during the conversation. Long conversations don't happen often for me." Several of the students started calling dibs on specific plates, such as the meat plates or pasta plates. Some were just admiring it and trying to figure out where it came from, since it was Jubilee's turn to cook. The noise coming from the kitchen seemed to attract more students, which in turn created more noise. One of the students who grabbed a plate, an African-American teen with a crew-cut hair, noticed Harry sitting in the corner with a plate and walked over. "Hey, you're the new guy who turned Kurt pink, right?" Harry was tempted to point out that his name was not Hay, but he couldn't expect everyone to have manners, so he said, "I'm pretty sure that's me, or at least someone going around looking like me." "I'm Harry, it's nice to meet you." "Cool to meet you too, Harry." "I'm Evan. You play any sports?" Harry shook his head, "Can't say I do. I'm a nerd who spends his days in books and messing with the laws of reality." Evan looked slightly disappointed but still said, "That's cool too. I think our nerds have a study group in the library after dinner, so you should totally meet up with them." Harry smiled and said, "Thanks, I'll definitely show up." Evan nodded and said, "So are you gonna try out for the team?" Harry gave a confused look, which caused Evan to continue, "The third X-Men team. Lots of those here want to be an X-Men, so we train a whole bunch to see who will make the final cut for the third team." Harry said, "If you don't mind me asking, what about the first and second teams?" "Well, the first team is my Anti-Storm, Wolverine, Angel, Beast, Colossus, Gambit, and Domino. There were others, but they either left or didn't make it out of the battle with the Shadow King. The second team is made from the best of the first batch of recruits: Bishop, Shadowcat, Pixie, Marrow, and Blink. They actually got captured by aliens last year and ended up getting dragged into a battle where they defeated a swarm of alien insects and saved a planet. They got an alien ship they used to fly back to the mansion. There was this guy called Warpath too, but he stayed behind. The current roster for the third team is myself, and I'm called Spike, by the way, Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Iceman, Rogue, and Nightcrawler, who you turned pink. So all these kids are trying out for a single team?" "Well, not exactly. No one is allowed to go on missions until you're at least 16, and most of us third-gen recruits are 16 or younger. To be honest, the current team is just the guys who are 16 or the guys closest to 16. I'm turning 16 next year." "Ah, me too. Never fought with a team before, so I'll probably try it out." "Oh, you fought before?" "That's right. I've had a few crazy adventures up to this point." "No way, dude." "It's true. You know the red laser eye guy? Cyclops? That's his name. Well, I kicked his ass yesterday." "No way. Seriously? Dude's been spending all day in the danger room like someone set a fire under his butt. Guess that explains why. Well, I'll see you later then, I'm gonna get a second plate." Harry wondered what would happen if he used his new multiplayer feature on any of these teams. Unfortunately, it would not be that easy. According to the FAQ on adding a new player, it was basically Harry directly injected his own Obscurus particles into someone else's body and then having the particles mimic the cells of that person to directly boost their physiology. Doing so would permanently cost him some Obscurus particles and lower his level, forcing him to regain those levels. The weaker someone was, the less he needed to inject to grant them player status. So someone like Forget-Me-Not would probably cost Harry 5 to 10 levels. Someone like Logan could cost Harry over 100 levels. Moreover, the person had to have absolute trust in Harry or they would reject the particles and the process would fail. The only person he might be able to get to trust him that much was the Ancient One, but she would probably cost more Obscurus particles than Harry actually had to convert her, which would take Harry to level 0 and permanently kill him. The process for both parties would also be indescribably painful. Turning someone into a new player would apply some of the benefits of Harry's abilities, but not all. Such a person would be able to absorb the energy of defeated foes, and the Obscurus particles would use that energy to replicate and further strengthen the body, allowing levels ups. If injured, the particles could also take the place of damaged cells, giving the player a limited healing factor dependent on the amount of particles they had. Harry's path system and menu would be applied, so the cells would apply autocorrect to skills they used that were a part of paths they practiced often. They would also be able to choose what stats increased with each level up. There was even a way for them to use battle meditation through Harry to generate monsters matching their level they could fight, but Harry had to be present and couldn't deal any damage himself, or else he would get the experience instead of the other player. What they would not be able to gain was the inventory, settings, pause function, or respawn features. Those were tied to Harry's soul and existence, and features like respawn only worked because Harry was 100% Obscurus particles while players would still have real flesh and blood. However, though they would not be able to respawn, increasing their level would increase the amount of Obscurus particles, which would raise the amount of damage they could recover from, which was not a bad consolation prize. Besides the pain, loss of levels, and high trust requirements, another reason Harry wasn't going to just give everyone this ability was because it would permanently connect them to Harry for the rest of their lives. Forget-Me-Not finished his mashed potatoes and said, "Thanks, man. I'm heading back to the room. You should spend the day wandering around and meet more of the guys." Later, Harry wanted to say something, but his roommate was already off. He couldn't help but notice that when Evan listed off the members of the first X-Men team, there were a lot, but the second X-Men team had so few and seemed to be the same age group as Forget-Me-Not. He'd ask him about that later. It didn't take long for details about the lunch miracle to spread around, and much of the mansion showed up. However, that only amounted to about 20 or so, as it was still summer and more than half the students had returned to their families who lived further out. Evan apparently had a nice family, but they lived nearby, so he would stay at the mansion during the summer anyways to train and play with friends while still going to see his parents pretty often. Since Harry was fully moving in, he had a lot of paperwork to do himself, so he headed over to the library with a large stack of sheets and got to work. Forms for permanent address change were among the easier ones he needed, while forms for further correspondence between himself and the goblins was harder. He would basically teleport to a warehouse they had and give them a large batch of gems and metals, and they would manually ship it to Xavier's Institute twice a month. It would take some time before they had the mundane machinery required for the mass production of large gemstones, so Harry would need to make them himself for now. One upside was that in the last few months before Harry moved to the States, the goblins had come up with a nearly perfect means of shielding electronics from exotic energy up to a specific range. It couldn't withstand direct apparition, but could survive indefinitely in a magic-rich environment without issue. The shielding itself was an inlay of specific metal alloys in specific configurations similar to runes, but in appearance more closely resembled circuitry. The technical term would be metamaterial, as it was a material that had properties outside the properties of the materials that it was constructed from. In addition to shielding the equipment from exotic energy, it also shielded from nearly every other type of energy except for heat. Radiation, radio waves, and even a few forms of extra-dimensional energy could not pass easily through this shielding. The shielding against radio waves meant that it could not transmit or receive signals, but that could be gotten around with a hardline connection or building in a paired set of quantum entanglement transmitters within. A massive benefit for this that Harry saw was that preventing energy coming in or out of the equipment meant it could not be wirelessly hacked, even using technopathy, and wouldn't need to be magically charged. Harry and the goblins, however, agreed this shielding would not be sold to the general public. It was perfectly acceptable to make their own equipment unhackable through any means, but quite a few goblins had become very good with computers and enjoyed the art of hacking others. It was a new battlefield, and though there was far less blood than they would have liked, the battles won in the field of hacking could still grant considerable wealth to the goblin who achieved it. Harry rented out his hack boxes to them to make sure they didn't get traced, though they weren't allowed to hack from important locations regardless. Once finished with his final sheet of paperwork, he made sure no one was around and set it all into his inventory. He'd send it via portkey to the goblins from his room and give the goblins the magical coordinates of his room so they had a location they could send portkey mail back to him at their convenience. Harry felt the phoenix flame within him act up and turned to see Jean enter the library and spot him. Hey Harry. So how's your first day been? Well, everyone is certainly very friendly, which is a welcome change. Not that the temple or my last school was cruel, but most everyone there was more or less indifferent to others. Yeah, we really try to be one big family here. Where'd you go before here? Well, I spent the last 2 years in a temple in Tibet training in martial arts and the more mystical aspects of my abilities. Before that I attended a boarding school in Scotland for a year. Apparently it was the same one my parents went to, but I got targeted by a terrorist, and though he was dealt with, I decided the school wasn't for me. Harry thought out as well that he memorized the school's library and knew more than many of the teachers, so he had nothing left to learn there. Jean looked like she wanted to ask something, so Harry just said aloud, I can absorb books, so I ordered a copy of pretty much every textbook the school had, which is how I got all that knowledge. Having her question answered, she said, oh, that's convenient. I wish I could do something like that, but I can only read people who are usually not comfortable with being read. Harry considered it and said, well, you're still welcome in my head when you wish, and every book I've memorized is within. Would you like a library card? What happens if I take a book without a library card? Nothing. The library card will allow you to find specific pieces of knowledge without having to look for it. However, if you take a book out and open it outside of the little reading area in my head, automated defenses will activate, so be careful. So would you like a library card or not? Jean looked as if she was mulling it over and said, I'm not sure it's such a good idea to spend so long in a boy's head. Harry thought wryly to himself that he didn't know she was already considering spending long amounts of time in his head, which caused her to blush when she heard the thought. She quickly said, I didn't mean it that way, it's just, well, when I'm inside your head, the thoughts of others are gone. I can usually hear everyone's thoughts around me, but for some reason when I specifically go inside your head, the thoughts of others are silent. She had no intention of telling him it also felt warm and comfortable in there, like relaxing in front of a fireplace after a long day. Harry said, that should be an effect of some of the mental practices I use. I can channel psionic energy like a telepath when I absorb a quartz crystal, and I've used that combined with some esoteric practices I've learned to create a very sturdy mind. Jean thought about that for a moment and asked, do you think I can learn that then? I would love to not have to listen to the thoughts of others day in and day out. Harry held out his hand in a gesture for Jean to take it, which she did after a moment of hesitation. Within the library of Harry's mind, a small card appeared in front of Jean's mental avatar, which she picked up. It vanished and Harry said, library card acquired. Just think about the knowledge you want and the books will appear. Just remember that you can only read them in the reading area. Jean frowned and said, I can't accept that, Harry. I mean, we've only just met and I feel like I'm taking advantage of you. Harry considered it and said, in that case there is something you can do for me. Within Harry's mind, Harry gave a book to Jean, who went over to the reading area and opened it. She gasped, Forget-me-not. Oh, no. The book contained Harry's knowledge on the imperceptible mutant. Harry asked, you remember him? She sighed, not completely. I think I told him I'd try not to forget him, but even then. Oh, he must hate me. Harry shook his head, no, I doubt that very much. Professor Xavier gave me an empty room with him, so he's my new roommate. I absorbed a lock of his hair the same way I can books, and now I won't forget him. Really? That's great. Indeed. However, I want to see if I can figure out a way for others to remember him. I see. That won't be easy. Even his thoughts are practically invisible. I'm not sure if I can't hear his thoughts or if I simply forget them when I can no longer hear them. And, oh no. I won't even remember talking about him later, will I? Harry said, probably. But that's what I'd like to test. With your permission, I'd like to look inside your head as you are forgetting him and try a few different ways to see if I can get people to remember him. Jean thought it was a bit hypocritical that she could see into other people's minds so easily, yet was uncomfortable with someone else going through her mind. That being said, it was for a good cause. She didn't want to owe Harry for letting her use his knowledge and head, and she also wanted to help Forget-me-not. Alright, but don't judge me for what you see and keep anything you find to yourself, okay? No problem. Plus I can help you arrange your mind if you want after you learn a few things. Harry had to purposefully allow thoughts to be heard when he wanted them to be heard by visiting telepaths, so many of his thoughts were not in fact heard by Jean. He was pretty satisfied with his idea and that it actually worked. With this, he would be able to get a closer look at the mental blocks within Jean and figure out a way to safely remove them. He could also test a few means to help Forget-me-not, so it was a case of the proverbial 2 birds with 1 stone. Plus he really did want to get to know Jean and didn't mind her looking through his head. She'd find a lot of things that didn't make sense, but in doing so would slowly acclimate herself to Harry's secrets, and when she knew him well enough, he hoped she would trust him to remove the mental blocks once he found a means to do it safely. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.